Love doesn't end with death. Sometimes it becomes eternal. When a cowboy and his faithful dog vanish into the Nevada desert in 1885, their story seems lost to time and sand. 11 years later, a lone traveler makes a discovery that will break hearts and heal wounds. Deep in a forgotten canyon, he finds two skeletons locked in final embrace, man and dog, together until the end. Word spreads, reaching 68-year-old Mabel Sutton, who spent over a decade wondering what became of her missing husband Red and his loyal companion Copper. What Mabel discovers on her journey will reveal the true meaning of devotion. But what really happened in those final days that kept them together, even in death? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted long shadows across Mabel Sutton's kitchen window as she moved through her daily ritual with the precision of someone who had performed these same tasks for more years than she cared to count. At 68, her movements carried the careful deliberation of age, each step measured and purposeful as she prepared her solitary breakfast. The kitchen held the accumulated warmth of decades, worn wooden counters polished smooth by countless meals, cast iron pans that had fed a family when there was still a family to feed, and the gentle tick of the mantel clock that Red had carved from pine during their second winter together. Everything in this house whispered of a life shared, now lived alone. Mabel's fingers found the delicate chain at her throat, a habit that had become as automatic as breathing. The thin gold links held Red's wedding ring, the band worn smooth from 23 years on his weathered hands before it found its new home against her heart. She'd moved it there the day the sheriff had given up the search, when hope had finally bowed to the weight of reality. 11 years. 11 years since Emmett Red Sutton had kissed her goodbye at this very kitchen door, his auburn hair catching the early morning light, Copper dancing at his heels with the excitement of a planned adventure. A week, he'd said. Maybe 10 days if the cattle were scattered further than expected. The local ranchers had lost nearly 50 head to rustlers, and Red had volunteered to help track them down, partly out of neighborly duty, mostly because he couldn't stand the thought of hard-working folks losing their livelihoods to thieves. That was Red's way. Always thinking of others, always ready to help, even when it meant leaving his own responsibilities behind. Mabel had learned to share her husband with every neighbor in need, every stray animal, every cause that called to his generous heart. She'd made peace with it years ago, understanding that the same gentle strength that drew her to him also compelled him to answer every call for help that crossed his path. The coffee finished brewing with a soft gurgle, and Mabel poured herself a cup, adding the single spoonful of sugar she allowed herself these days. Dr. Morrison had suggested she watch her constitution, though at her age she sometimes wondered what exactly she was preserving herself for. The ranch ran itself mostly, what little remained of it. She'd sold off most of the land over the years, keeping just enough to maintain the house and a small garden that provided more purpose than sustenance. Outside the window, the Nevada landscape stretched endlessly, all sagebrush and distant mountains painted in shades of gold and purple by the climbing sun. This land had shaped them all, Red, herself, and their daughter Sarah. Though Sarah had chosen to let it shape her into someone who needed to escape it, Sarah, the thought of her daughter, brought the familiar ache of love mixed with regret. 35 now, married to a banker in San Francisco, living a life as foreign to Mabel as the moon itself. They exchanged letters at Christmas and birthdays, careful correspondence that skimmed the surface of their lives like stones across water, never quite breaking through to the depths below. The last time Sarah had been home was for her 24th birthday, the year before Red disappeared. Even then, the distance between them had been growing, not in miles but in understanding. Sarah had inherited her father's stubborn streak, but none of his patience, his quick temper, but little of his forgiveness. When Red vanished, Sarah's grief had crystallized into anger, at him for leaving, at Mabel for defending him, at the whole frontier life that had claimed her father and, in her mind, wasted her mother's devotion. "He left us," Sarah had said during their last real conversation, her voice sharp with the kind of pain that cuts deepest when it comes from love. "He chose some fool adventure over his family. And you're still making excuses for him." Mabel had tried to explain what Sarah was too young and too hurt to understand, that Red hadn't chosen anything over them. He'd chosen to protect what they'd built together, to stand up for the community that had welcomed them and supported them through lean years and good ones alike. But Sarah had already made up her mind, and Mabel had learned the hard way that you couldn't argue someone out of their grief. The silence between them had grown like a canyon, wider each year, until now their relationship existed mostly in Mabel's memory and hope. She kept Sarah's childhood room exactly as it had been, not out of any delusion that her daughter would return, but because some things shouldn't be erased just because they caused pain. Mabel settled into her favorite chair by the window, the one Red had positioned so she could watch the road while she mended or read. How many evenings had she spent here, watching for his familiar silhouette on horseback, Copper loping alongside. In the early years after his disappearance, that vigil had been desperate, hopeful. Later it became meditation, a way of honoring memory while accepting loss. The house around her held layers of their shared life like tree rings. The front room, where Red had proposed, going down on one knee beside the fireplace he'd built with his own hands. The kitchen table, where they'd planned their future over countless cups of coffee. The bedroom, where they'd whispered dreams and fears in the darkness. Where she'd lain awake those first nights after he left, listening for sounds that never came. Red had been 34 when they married, already weathered by frontier life, but still quick to smile. Still gentle with children and animals, despite hands that could break a wild horse or face down a mountain lion. Mabel had been 26, old enough to know her own mind, young enough to believe that love could overcome anything the harsh country might throw at them. For the most part, it had. They'd weathered drought and harsh winters, the death of their first baby, a son who lived only 3 days, and the lean years when cattle prices dropped and every meal had to be stretched. Through it all, Red's steadiness had been her anchor. His quiet strength, the foundation on which she'd built her understanding of what marriage could be. When Sarah was born 2 years later, red-faced and squalling, Red had cried openly, holding his daughter with the same gentle reverence he showed everything precious. He'd been a devoted father, patient with Sarah's questions, encouraging her curiosity, even when it led her into mischief. He'd taught her to ride, to read animal tracks, to find her way by the stars. Skills Sarah had later dismissed as frontier foolishness, but which had shaped her more than she cared to admit. Now, as Mabel sat in the morning quiet, she could almost hear their voices, Red's low rumble, explaining some aspect of ranch life, Sarah's higher tones chattering about discoveries and adventures. The ghosts of their shared happiness both comforted and haunted her. Reminders of what had been lost and what might have been. The mantel clock chimed 8 times, marking another hour in another day of the careful routine that kept loneliness at bay. Soon she would tend her garden, check on the few chickens she still kept, perhaps walk down to the creek where Red had taught Sarah to fish. These rituals sustained her, connecting her to the life they'd built together even in his absence. She'd learned to find contentment in small things, the taste of coffee, the warmth of sunshine through glass, the satisfaction of a well-tended garden. But beneath that surface, peace ran a current of unfinished business, of questions that might never be answered. Where had Red drawn his last breath? Had he suffered? Had he thought of home? The ring against her chest caught the morning light, a small circle of gold that had once symbolized the completeness of their union. Now it represented something different. Endurance, the kind of love that outlasts presence, that finds ways to honor what was lost while still embracing what remains. Mabel Sutton had learned to live with mystery, to find peace in uncertainty. But deep in her heart she still watched the road, still listened for familiar footsteps, still believed that some stories are meant to find their endings, even when those endings come years after the story seem to have stopped. Outside, the desert wind stirred the sagebrush, carrying scents of sage and distant rain. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon she could see from her window, lay answers she'd stopped hoping to find. But hope, she'd discovered, had its own stubborn persistence, rising like desert flowers after rain, unexpected and impossibly resilient. Today would be like yesterday and the day before, quiet, purposeful, tinged with memory. But Mabel had learned that even the most ordinary days could be interrupted by extraordinary news. That life had a way of completing circles just when you'd convinced yourself they would remain forever broken. She finished her coffee and rose to begin her day. The ring settling against her heart with its familiar weight, carrying with it all the love and loss that had shaped her into the woman she'd become. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried by young Billy Henderson, who rode for the territorial mail service. Mabel heard the hoofbeats long before she saw horse and rider crest the small rise that led to her property. And something in the purposeful rhythm of the approach made her set down her mending and move to the window. Billy rarely came this far out unless there was official business. And official business at her age usually meant bad news of one sort or another. She watched him dismount, noting the careful way he handled the leather satchel, the formal set of his shoulders. This wasn't a casual delivery. "Morning, Mrs. Sutton," Billy called, touching his hat brim as she opened the door. "Got something here from Sheriff Morrison. Says it's important." The envelope was heavier than usual, bearing the official seal of Carson County in dark blue wax. Her name was written in the sheriff's careful script across cream-colored paper that spoke of serious business. Mabel's hands remained steady as she accepted it, though something deep in her chest had begun to flutter like a bird trapped against glass. "Thank you. Billy, would you like some water before you head back?" "That's kind, ma'am, but I've got 3 more stops before noon." He paused, hat in his hands, clearly wanting to say something more. "Mrs. Sutton?" Sheriff seemed real thoughtful when he handed me that letter. "Said to tell you he's available if you need anything." After Billy rode away, Mabel stood in her doorway for a long moment, holding the letter, but not yet ready to open it. The desert stretched before her, unchanged and eternal, indifferent to human hopes and fears. Somewhere out there, Red had disappeared into that vastness 11 years ago. She'd long since made peace with never knowing exactly where or how, but peace, she realized as she finally broke the seal, was a fragile thing. The sheriff's handwriting was precise, formal, the words chosen with the careful consideration of a man who'd delivered difficult news many times before. "Mrs. Emmett Sutton, it is my duty to inform you of a discovery made 3 days past in the desert region, approximately 40 miles northeast of your property. A traveling merchant, one Jacob Whitmore, found what appears to be human remains in a sheltered canyon known locally as Devil's Rest. The remains, along with those of a dog, were found in circumstances that suggest they may be those of your husband, Emmett, and his companion. Personal effects recovered from the site include a leather belt with silver buckle bearing the initials ES, and other items consistent with your husband's known possessions. I understand this news comes after many years of uncertainty, and I want to assure you that the remains have been treated with proper respect. Mr. Whitmore, being a decent Christian man, covered them and marked the location before continuing to town to report his find. If you wish to claim the remains for proper burial, I can arrange for a guide to take you to the location. The journey would require 2 to 3 days and would be physically demanding. Given the remote nature of the site, please know that you have my deepest sympathy, and I remain at your service for whatever assistance you may require during this difficult time. Respectfully yours, Sheriff Thomas Morrison. Mabel read the letter 3 times, each reading bringing a different wave of emotion. Relief that the mystery was finally solved. Grief renewed by the confirmation of what she'd known in her heart for years. And underneath it all, a strange sense of completeness. As if a circle long left open was finally being closed. She walked to her bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed she'd shared with Red, the letter still in her hands. Devil's Rest. She knew the area by name, if not by sight, rough country, the kind of place a man might shelter if he was hurt or lost. The kind of place where weather and time could preserve what they claimed, holding stories in stone and sand until someone came to read them. The mention of copper brought tears she hadn't expected. Red's faithful companion, a golden-coated mutt with mismatched ears and a heart bigger than his considerable body. The dog had followed Red everywhere, content to wait patiently while his master worked, always ready for the next adventure. That they'd been found together felt right, in a way that eased some of the ache in her chest. But the practical questions began to crowd in around the emotional ones. The journey would indeed be demanding. 3 days in the desert, camping under stars she hadn't slept beneath in over a decade. At 68, she wasn't sure she had the strength for such a trek. But she also couldn't bear the thought of leaving Red out there, couldn't stomach the idea of him remaining in that lonely place when he belonged beside her family's plot in the Clearwater Cemetery. The bigger question, the one that made her stomach clench with anxiety, was whether to attempt this alone, or to reach out to the daughter who'd spent 11 years building walls between them. Mabel stood and walked to the small writing desk by the window, pulling out paper and pen with the deliberate movements of someone who'd made a difficult decision. The letter to Sarah took her 3 attempts, each draft either too pleading or too formal, too revealing or too distant. Finally, she settled on simple truth. "My dearest Sarah, I pray this letter finds you and Thomas well. I've received news from Sheriff Morrison that remains believed to be your father's have been discovered in the desert. After 11 years, we finally have the answer we've been waiting for. I plan to travel to the site to bring him home for proper burial. The journey will be difficult, and I would understand if you feel unable to make the trip. But if any part of you wishes to see your father laid to rest beside his parents, I would welcome your company. I know there has been distance between us, and I know you carry anger about your father's choices. Perhaps this journey might help us both find some peace with what happened, and with each other. I love you, daughter, and I have missed you more than words can express. Your mother, Mabel." She sealed the letter before she could change her mind again, addressing it to Sarah's home in San Francisco. The afternoon stage would carry it east, and with luck, it would reach Sarah within a week. Whether Sarah would come remained to be seen, but Mabel had learned that some invitations had to be extended regardless of their likely reception. The rest of the day passed in a strange suspension between ordinary routine and momentous change. She tended her garden, fed her chickens, prepared her simple dinner, but underneath these familiar activities ran a current of anticipation and dread. After 11 years of questions, she was about to have answers. After 11 years of grief without closure, she was about to say goodbye. That evening, as sunset painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Mabel sat on her front porch with Red's ring warm against her palm. She'd removed it from the chain for the first time in years, needing to hold it to connect with the tangible proof of their love. The ring was simple as Red had been, a plain gold band worn thin by work and time. But it had encircled his finger through their wedding vows, through the birth of their daughter, through seasons of joy and hardship. It had been part of him, and now it was all she had left of the man who'd shaped her understanding of love, loyalty, and loss. Tomorrow, she would begin making arrangements for the journey. She would contact old Pete Hawkins, the most experienced desert guide in the territory. She would pack supplies, prepare for the physical demands of the trail, steel herself for whatever they might find at Devil's Rest. But tonight, she simply sat with her memories and her grief, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere under those same stars, Red had drawn his last breath. Soon, she would finally be able to bring him home. The telegram arrived first, brief and formal. "Arriving Thursday. Will help with arrangements. Sarah." 3 days later, Mabel stood at her kitchen window, watching a hired buggy navigate the rutted road that led to her ranch. Even from a distance, she could see the careful posture of the woman inside, the way she held herself apart from the dust and roughness of the journey home. Sarah stepped down from the buggy with the measured grace of someone accustomed to city sidewalks. Her traveling dress a deep blue wool that spoke of prosperity and propriety. She carried herself differently now, shoulders squared, chin raised, every movement deliberate and controlled. But when she turned to retrieve her suitcase, Mabel caught a glimpse of the girl she'd once been, the way her hand hesitated before grasping the worn leather handle. The suitcase itself told a story. Once it had been Sarah's wedding present from her father, purchased in Sacramento during one of his rare trips to sell cattle. Now it bore the accumulated scars of travel, scratches from railway platforms, stickers from hotels in Denver and Chicago, the patina of a life lived far from desert dust and frontier simplicities. Yet underneath the evidence of her new world, Mabel could still see Red's careful stitching where he'd reinforced the handle. His initials burned into the leather beside the lock. Mother. Sarah's greeting was formal, delivered with a slight incline of her head as she approached the porch. She'd inherited Red's height but carried it differently, using it to maintain distance rather than invite closeness. Sarah. Mabel's voice caught slightly on her daughter's name. 11 years of letters couldn't prepare a mother for seeing how time had changed her child's face. Sarah was beautiful still, but it was a cultivated beauty now, refined and controlled. Her auburn hair was pinned in the latest fashion, her gloves spotless despite the journey, her bearing that of a woman who'd learned to navigate social complexities Mabel could barely imagine. They stood facing each other across a gulf that seemed to measure more than the few feet of porch boards between them. Mabel had practiced this moment, imagined different versions of their reunion. But reality felt stilted and strange, weighted with everything they hadn't said to each other over the years. "You look well," Sarah said finally, her eyes taking in the familiar surroundings with an expression Mabel couldn't quite read. "The ranch seems smaller than I remembered. Things tend to shrink when you're used to city spaces," Mabel replied, immediately regretting the defensive edge in her voice. "Come inside. You must be tired from the journey." Sarah's childhood room had been preserved like a shrine, and Mabel watched her daughter's face as she took in the unchanged space. The patchwork quilt Red had helped her piece together when Sarah was 12, the shelf of books she'd loved, the window that looked out toward the creek where she'd spent countless summer afternoons. For a moment, Sarah's careful composure slipped, and Mabel saw grief flicker across her features. "Everything's exactly the same," Sarah murmured, running her fingers along the edge of the wooden dresser Red had built for her 16th birthday. "I couldn't bring myself to change it," Mabel admitted. "I kept thinking you might come home for a visit. This isn't home anymore." The words came quickly, defensively. "I have a life in San Francisco. Thomas and we've built something good there." "I know." Mabel settled into the chair by the window, the same one where she'd read Sarah bedtime stories decades ago. "Tell me about him. About your life there." Sarah remained standing, as if committing to the chair would be committing to something larger. "Thomas is a good man. He manages investments for several important families. We have a house on Nob Hill, servants, a place in society." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "It's a different world than this one." "Do you have children?" The question had haunted Mabel for years, the possibility that she might be a grandmother without knowing it. "No." Sarah's voice was flat, final. "Thomas and I decided it wasn't the right time. His career requires travel, social obligations. A child would complicate things." Mabel nodded, though the words struck her like a physical blow. She'd imagined grandchildren, dreamed of letters full of stories about little ones who might carry Red's eyes or Sarah's stubborn streak. Another door closed, another connection severed, mother about father. Sarah finally sat, perching on the edge of the bed as if ready to flee. "I received your letter and I understand why you need to do this. But I want you to know that my coming here doesn't change how I feel about what happened. He didn't abandon us, Sarah. He left." The words carried 11 years of accumulated pain. He chose to ride off into the desert, chasing God knows what, instead of staying home where he belonged. He chose adventure over responsibility. and we paid the price. Mabel felt the familiar ache of this old argument, the weight of trying to explain something Sarah seemed determined not to understand. Your father was protecting people, protecting the life we'd built here. Those rustlers would have destroyed every rancher in the valley if someone hadn't stopped them. And why did it have to be him? Sarah's voice rose, carrying echoes of the angry young woman she'd been when Red disappeared. Why couldn't he let someone else be the hero? Why did he always have to be the one to save everyone else, while his own family waited at home? The question hung between them, laden with old resentments and fresh grief. Mabel understood her daughter's anger, had even shared it during the darkest nights after Red vanished. But she'd also known the man Sarah was judging, had seen the way he carried other people's burdens as if they were his own, had loved him partly because of that very quality Sarah now condemned. Because that's who he was, Mabel said quietly. He couldn't walk away when people needed help any more than he could stop breathing. It wasn't a choice for him, Sarah. It was who he was, and who he was got him killed. Sarah's voice broke slightly on the words. Who he was left me without a father and you without a husband. How can you still defend that? Mabel rose and moved to the window, looking out at the land Red had loved, the vista he'd chosen over easier opportunities in more settled places. Because love doesn't stop when someone dies, even when they die making choices you don't understand. Because he was a good man who tried to do right by everyone, even when it cost him everything. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was smaller, more vulnerable. I was 14, Mother. 14 and angry and scared, and he just left. One morning he was there making jokes at breakfast, and then he was gone forever. How was I supposed to understand that? How was I supposed to forgive it? The words revealed the heart of Sarah's pain, not just a daughter's grief, but a child's abandonment, a young woman's fear that love could vanish without warning. Mabel turned back to her daughter, seeing past the composed city woman to the frightened girl who'd waited by this same window for a father who never came home. You weren't, Mabel said gently. You were supposed to be angry and hurt and confused. You were supposed to blame him and me and the whole unfair world that took him away. But Sarah, you don't have to carry that anger forever. Sarah wiped her eyes with a handkerchief that bore her married initials, the gesture both elegant and heartbreaking. I don't know how to let it go. I've been angry for so long, I don't remember what it felt like before. Maybe this journey will help you remember, Mabel suggested. Maybe seeing where he ended up, understanding what really happened, might give you some peace. Or maybe it will just confirm that he died for nothing, chasing shadows in the desert while his family grieved. Sarah stood, smoothing her skirts with hands that shook slightly. But I'm here, aren't I? Whatever I think about his choices, he was still my father. He deserves a proper burial. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a beginning. Mabel nodded, understanding that some wounds heal slowly, that some reunions happen in stages rather than moments. Her daughter had come home, carrying her anger and her grief like familiar burdens. Perhaps that was enough for now. Dawn broke clear and still, as old Pete Hawkins arrived at the ranch, leading 2 pack mules and riding a grizzled Mustang that looked like it had been carved from the desert itself. Pete was past 70, but moved with the careful efficiency of a man who'd spent his life reading weather and terrain, understanding the ways the wilderness could kill the unprepared. Morning, Mabel, he called, touching his hat brim. This your daughter I've been hearing about? Sarah emerged from the house carrying her traveling bag, now wearing the riding clothes Mabel had suggested, a split skirt of sturdy brown wool, boots that had belonged to a neighbor's daughter, and a wide-brimmed hat to shield her face from the desert sun. She looked uncomfortable in the practical garments, like a woman playing a role she'd forgotten how to perform. Sarah, this is Pete Hawkins, Mabel said. He's guided more people through the desert than anyone in the territory. Pete studied Sarah with eyes that had evaluated countless travelers, gauging their fitness for the challenges ahead. City living ain't the best preparation for desert travel, he said bluntly. You sure you're up for this, young lady? "I'm 35, Mr. Hawkins, not some fragile flower," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the crisp authority she'd learned in San Francisco drawing rooms. "I believe I can manage 3 days on horseback." Pete's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. "Desert don't much care about your manners or your age, miss. But I reckon we'll find out what you're made of soon enough." As they loaded their supplies, Pete noticed Mabel carefully wrapping something in oilcloth before placing it in her saddlebag. "What's that you're packing so careful like?" Mabel's hand rested protectively on the small bundle. "Red's compass. I found it among his things when I was preparing for the trip. Thought it belonged with him." She unwrapped the compass briefly, revealing a brass instrument that gleamed despite its age. The case was worn smooth from handling, and tiny scratches marked the crystal face, evidence of countless journeys across unmarked terrain. Red had carried it on every cattle drive, every hunting trip, every venture beyond the familiar boundaries of their ranch. "Good compass," Pete observed, noting the quality of the craftsmanship. "Man who owned that knew his business." "He did," Mabel said quietly, rewrapping the instrument. "It never led him astray. Except for the last time," Sarah added, her voice sharp with old pain. Pete glanced between mother and daughter, reading the tension with the same skill he used to predict weather. "Compass only points the way, miss. Can't make a man's choices for him." They set out as the sun cleared the eastern mountains, following a trail that led steadily away from civilization and into the harsh beauty of the Nevada desert. The landscape unfolded in layers, first the familiar scrubland near Mabel's ranch, then rolling hills covered in sagebrush and juniper, finally opening into the vast emptiness that had swallowed Red 11 years before. Pete set a steady pace, neither hurried nor leisurely, the rhythm of someone who understood that the desert demanded respect rather than haste. He rode slightly ahead, constantly scanning the horizon, reading signs in the landscape that remained invisible to his companions. "How far is it?" Sarah asked after the first hour, already feeling the unfamiliar strain of sustained riding. "Devil's Rest is about 40 miles northeast," Pete replied. "We'll make maybe 15 miles today, camp at Willow Springs tonight. Take most of tomorrow to reach the canyon." Sarah shifted in her saddle, grimacing slightly. City life had not prepared her for the constant motion, the dust, the heat that seemed to press against them like a living thing. But she rode in silence, pride preventing her from voicing any complaint. Mabel watched her daughter struggle and remembered Sarah as a child, so eager to ride with her father that she'd beg to be lifted onto his horse before her legs were long enough to reach the stirrups. Red had been patient with her then, teaching her to read the rhythm of the horse's gait, to move with the animal rather than fighting it. "Relax your shoulders," Mabel suggested gently. "You're fighting the horse instead of riding it." "I remember how to ride," Sarah snapped, then immediately looked embarrassed by her sharp tone. "I'm sorry. It's just been a while. Riding's like breathing," Pete said from ahead. "You don't forget, but you can get out of practice. Give yourself time to remember." As the morning progressed, Sarah's posture gradually relaxed, muscle memory reasserting itself despite years of disuse. Color returned to her cheeks, and some of the rigid control she wore like armor began to soften in the desert air. "I used to love this," she admitted during their noon rest, looking out over the endless expanse of sand and rock. "When I was small, I thought the desert was the most beautiful place in the world." "What changed?" Mabel asked, genuinely curious about her daughter's transformation. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, absently braiding her horse's mane. "I suppose I learned to see it as a trap instead of a paradise. All that emptiness, all that isolation. It seemed like a prison after Father disappeared." "Same landscape, different eyes," Pete observed, checking their water supplies. "Desert don't change much. People do." They resumed their journey in the afternoon heat, the sun beating down from a cloudless sky. Pete led them through country that seemed designed to test human endurance. Dry washes that could become deadly torrents with little warning. Rocky passages where a horse's misstep could mean disaster. Stretches of alkali flats that reflected heat like mirrors. But there was beauty too, visible to those who knew how to look. The subtle colors of stone and sand, the delicate architecture of wind-carved formations, the surprising resilience of plants that bloomed briefly after rain, then waited patiently for the next opportunity. Pete pointed out these details as they rode, his commentary a gentle education in desert appreciation. "Your father loved this country," Mabel told Sarah as they navigated a particularly scenic stretch where red rock formations rose like ancient cathedrals. "He used to say it was honest country, harsh but fair, beautiful if you learned to see it right." "Honest," Sarah repeated thoughtfully. "That's one word for it." "I might have chosen merciless. Both can be true," Pete said. "Desert'll kill you quick if you don't respect it. But it'll also show you things you can't see anywhere else. Show you what you're really made of." As evening approached, they reached Willow Springs, a small oasis where underground water created a pocket of green in the surrounding brown. Pete set up camp with practiced efficiency, while Mabel and Sarah tended to the horses, working together in the awkward harmony of people rediscovering old rhythms. Around the campfire that night, as stars emerged in the vast desert sky, some of the formal distance between mother and daughter began to dissolve. The isolation, the shared physical demands of the journey, the weight of their common purpose, all worked to strip away layers of protective reserve. "I remember camping with Father," Sarah said quietly, watching sparks rise into the darkness. "He'd point out constellations, tell stories about the stars. I felt so safe then, like nothing bad could happen as long as he was there." "He felt the same way about you," Mabel replied. "You were the light of his life, Sarah. Everything he did was to build a better world for you." "Then why did he leave us?" The question held less anger now, more genuine bewilderment. Pete stirred the fire with a stick, sending new sparks skyward. "Sometimes a man's got to choose between what he wants and what he thinks is right. Don't make the choice easy, just makes it necessary." In her saddlebag, Red's compass waited in its oilcloth wrapping, its needle pointing steadily north, even in the darkness. Tomorrow they would need its guidance to navigate the final stretch to Devil's Rest, where answers lay buried in sand and stone, waiting to complete a story that had been suspended in grief for 11 long years. The second day's ride brought them deeper into country that seemed untouched by human presence, where wind-carved stone told stories older than memory, and silence stretched like a living thing. By mid-afternoon, Pete began pointing out landmarks, a distinctive rock formation shaped like a sleeping giant, a dry wash that caught rainwater in hidden pools, the subtle changes in vegetation that marked different types of soil beneath the sand. "Devil's Rest is just ahead," he announced as they crested a low ridge. "Got its name from the way sound echoes in there. Miners used to say they could hear voices when there wasn't nobody around to make them." Below them lay a sheltered canyon, its walls rising in smooth curves of red and yellow sandstone. The entrance was narrow, almost hidden, but once inside, the space opened into a natural amphitheater, perhaps 100 feet across. Centuries of wind had carved the stone into flowing patterns, creating alcoves and overhangs that offered protection from both sun and storm. "There," Pete said quietly, pointing to a spot near the canyon's far wall. "That's where Whitmore found them." The site was marked by a simple cairn of stacked stones, a marker that stood out against the natural disorder of the canyon floor. As they approached, Mabel felt her breath catch in her throat. After 11 years of wandering, she was finally looking at the place where Red had drawn his last breath. The remains had been covered with canvas and weighted down with rocks, Whitmore's attempt to preserve what he'd found until proper arrangements could be made. Pete dismounted first, approaching the site with the careful reverence of a man who'd seen death in many forms, but never lost his respect for it. "I'll take a look first," he said gently. "Make sure everything's as it should be before you ladies see." But Mabel was already climbing down from her horse, moving toward the covered forms with the determination of someone who'd traveled too far to be deterred by squeamishness. Sarah followed more reluctantly, her face pale but her jaw set with inherited stubbornness. Pete carefully lifted one corner of the canvas, peering underneath before nodding to Mabel. "It's them," he said simply. And Whitmore was right about how they were found. The desert had done its work with characteristic thoroughness. What remained were bones bleached white by sun and sand, but they told a story that was both heartbreaking and beautiful. The larger skeleton lay on its side, one arm curved protectively around the smaller form beside it. The dog had been positioned as if sleeping, his head resting against his master's chest, faithfully maintaining his watch even in death. "Oh, Red," Mabel whispered, sinking to her knees beside the remains. 11 years of uncertainty dissolved into the simple grief of finally knowing, finally seeing the evidence of what her heart had long accepted. Sarah stood frozen, several feet away, staring at what was left of the father she barely remembered but had spent years resenting. "He looks so small," she said, her voice barely audible. "Death has a way of putting things in perspective," Pete observed quietly. As they examined the site more carefully, details began to emerge that painted a picture of Red's final days. The remains lay in what had clearly been a makeshift shelter, protected by an overhang that would have provided shade and some protection from weather. Scattered around them were the remnants of a small camp, bits of leather that might once have been saddlebags, the rust-stained remains of what could have been a cooking pot, and partially buried in the sand nearby, something that made Mabel's heart skip. "Pete," she called softly, "there's something here." He came over to where she was gently brushing sand away from a partially buried object. As the dirt cleared, a leather collar emerged, cracked and weathered, but still intact. The brass nameplate, green with age, bore a single word etched in Red's careful script: copper. Mabel lifted the collar with shaking hands, feeling the weight of years and loyalty in the worn leather. Red had made this collar himself, she remembered, cutting and stitching the leather with the same careful attention he brought to everything he crafted. Copper had worn it proudly, the nameplate catching sunlight as he ran alongside Red's horse. "He never took it off," Sarah said wonderingly, moving closer despite herself. "Even at the end, Copper was still wearing his collar." "That dog loved your father more than life itself," Mabel said, cradling the collar against her chest. "Red used to joke that if he ever went to heaven, he'd have to sneak Copper in with him because no dog had ever been more devoted." As they continued their examination, Pete's experienced eye began to read the story the site told. "See here," he said, pointing to markings in the stone near where Red lay. "Looks like he tried to signal for help. Scratched marks in the rock, probably trying to catch sunlight and reflect it." "Why didn't anyone see it?" Sarah asked. "Devil's Rest is well off the main trails," Pete explained. "A man would have to know exactly where to look to spot signals from down here. And by the time Red got this far from the regular routes, he was probably already in trouble." The evidence suggested that Red had made it to the canyon but had been unable to leave. Whether injured in a fall, bitten by a snake, or simply overcome by exhaustion and dehydration, he'd been trapped in this beautiful but isolated place. But the arrangement of the remains told another story, one of loyalty and love that transcended circumstances. "Look at how Copper is positioned," Mabel pointed out to Sarah. "He could have left, could have tried to find help or water, but he stayed. He chose to stay with your father until the end." The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. Here was devotion without questions, loyalty without conditions. While she'd spent 11 years angry at her father for leaving, his faithful companion had chosen to die beside him rather than abandon him in his final hours. "I don't understand," Sarah said, tears beginning to flow. "Why didn't Copper try to get help? Why didn't he save himself?" "Because that's what love looks like sometimes," Mabel said gently. "Not the kind that asks questions or weighs options, but the kind that simply stays. The kind that says, if this is where you are, then this is where I belong." Pete busied himself setting up camp nearby, giving the women space to grieve and process what they'd found. As the afternoon light slanted through the canyon, painting the stone walls in shades of gold and amber, mother and daughter sat beside the remains of the man and dog who'd shaped both their lives in different ways. "He really didn't abandon us, did he?" Sarah asked finally, her voice small and broken. "No, sweetheart," Mabel replied, reaching for her daughter's hand. "He got trapped out here, probably trying to do what he thought was right. But he never chose to leave us. He would have come home if he could." Sarah squeezed her mother's fingers, the first physical contact they'd shared since her arrival. "I've been so angry for so long. I convinced myself he didn't care enough to stay, that adventure mattered more to him than family." "The anger protected you," Mabel said understandingly. "It's easier to be mad at someone for leaving than to accept that sometimes good people die for reasons we can't control." As evening approached, they made their own camp in the canyon, not far from where Red had spent his final days. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. 3 generations of the same family gathering around a fire in this ancient place, connected by love and loss and the strange mercy of finally knowing the truth. In the gathering darkness, Copper's collar caught the firelight, its brass nameplate gleaming like a small beacon. It was a tangible reminder of faithfulness that had lasted beyond death, of the kind of devotion that asks nothing and gives everything. The sort of love that Red had inspired in both his dog and despite everything. In the family he'd left behind, the next morning brought a systematic search of the canyon, Pete's trained eye guiding them to areas where the shifting sands might have concealed other artifacts. The desert had a way of preserving some things while destroying others. And experience had taught him that the most valuable discoveries often lay just beneath the surface. Red was a careful man, Pete observed as they worked. If he was stuck here for any length of time, he would have tried to leave some record, some explanation for whoever found him. They searched in expanding circles around the remains, brushing sand away from promising shapes, investigating every shadow that might hide something human-made. Sarah worked with surprising dedication, her city-soft hands already showing the effects of rough work, but her determination unwavering. It was Mabel who found it, her fingers detecting something unusual beneath what appeared to be just another wind drift of sand. "There's something here," she called, beginning to dig more carefully. What emerged was a bundle wrapped in oiled leather, buried deliberately about 3 feet from where Red's body lay. The leather had protected its contents from moisture and sand, creating a time capsule that had waited 11 years for discovery. Pete helped her lift it carefully, recognizing the significance of finding something Red had obviously intended to preserve. Inside the outer wrapping was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed but intact, filled with Red's careful handwriting. Mabel's hands trembled as she opened it, seeing her husband's familiar script for the first time in over a decade. The entries began several weeks before his disappearance, but the early pages dealt with routine ranch business, notes about cattle prices, weather observations, reminders about fencing repairs. "Look at the date on this entry," Sarah said, reading over her mother's shoulder. "This is from the day he left." Mabel found the entry and began to read aloud. May 15th, 1885. Leaving at dawn to join Henderson's tracking party. Told Mabel it was about the missing cattle, which is true enough as far as it goes. But Morrison showed me something yesterday that changes things. These aren't just rustlers taking a few head here and there. The signs point to something bigger, more organized. Professional thieves with connections to buyers in California. The sheriff thinks we're dealing with the Colton gang, the same ones that hit the ranches near Sacramento last year. If that's true, this isn't work for local ranchers with good intentions and poor training. These men are killers, and they'll murder anyone who gets in their way. Couldn't tell Mabel the real danger. She'd have tried to stop me, and she'd have been right to try. But if we don't stop them here, they'll destroy every honest rancher in the territory. Some things a man has to do, even when he wishes someone else could do them instead. The words hung in the desert air like an indictment, revealing the weight of responsibility Red had carried alone. Mabel felt her understanding of his disappearance shift fundamentally. He hadn't been chasing adventure or playing at being a hero. He'd been protecting their entire way of life, shouldering a burden too dangerous to share. He knew, Sarah whispered. He knew how dangerous it was, and he went anyway. Mabel turned the pages, reading entries that chronicled Red's growing understanding of what they were facing. The journal revealed a methodical investigation, careful observations of tracks and camps, evidence that the rustlers were indeed professionals operating with military precision. May 18th, found their main camp 20 miles north of Devil's Rest. At least 15 men, heavily armed with a remuda of stolen horses that would make a cavalry unit proud. They're not just stealing cattle. They're stealing entire herds, then driving them through mountain passes to buyers who don't ask questions. Henderson wants to ride in tomorrow with the 6 men we have. I convinced him to wait, send for more help from Carson City. These men will fight, and they'll fight dirty. We need law enforcement, not a bunch of ranchers with more courage than sense. Copper doesn't like the smell of their camp. Dog's got better instincts than most men I know. If he's nervous, I should be too. The entries continued, painting a picture of a man increasingly isolated as his companions grew impatient with caution and careful planning. Red had become the voice of restraint in a group of men who wanted immediate action, putting him in the difficult position of holding back friends who saw delay as cowardice. "Listen to this," Mabel said, finding an entry that made her heart ache. May 20th, Henderson and the others rode out this morning without me. Said they were tired of waiting for reinforcements that might never come. I argued that rushing in would get them all killed, but fear makes men do foolish things. I should have gone with them, should have stayed with the group even if I thought their plan was wrong. Instead, I decided to shadow them from a distance, try to provide help if things went bad. Copper and I are camped above their route, watching their dust. If something happens to me, I want Mabel to know I wasn't being reckless. I was trying to be smart about something that couldn't be made safe. Sometimes the right choice and the safe choice are different things. I miss my girls. Miss the smell of Mabel's coffee in the morning. Miss Sarah's chatter about her books and dreams. If I could be anywhere in the world right now, it would be at my own kitchen table, listening to them plan their day. A man doesn't know what he has until he's far enough away to see it clearly. Sarah was crying openly now, tears falling onto the journal pages as she read her father's words. The anger she'd carried for 11 years was crumbling, replaced by a grief that was pure and clean, uncontaminated by resentment. The later entries told the story of disaster and its aftermath. Henderson's group had indeed been ambushed, with several men killed and the survivors scattered. Red had attempted to help, but had been injured in the process, thrown from his horse while trying to reach wounded men under fire. May 22nd. Leg is broken, probably in 2 places. Managed to get myself and Copper to shelter in the canyon, but I won't be riding out of here any time soon. Horse ran off during the shooting. Can't blame him. Sent Copper toward home twice, but he keeps coming back. Stubborn dog thinks his place is here with me. Maybe he's right. If this is where I die, at least I won't die alone. The rustlers are gone, pulled out fast after the fight, probably figured the law would come looking. They were wrong, but they were smart to run. This country's too big for men to find what doesn't want to be found. The final entries were shorter, written in an increasingly shaky hand as Red's condition deteriorated. But they revealed a man at peace with his choices, even as he faced their consequences. May 26th, not much time left. Water's nearly gone, and I can't travel to find more. Copper won't leave, won't save himself. Maybe that's what love looks like. Staying when leaving would be smarter. I did what I thought was right. Maybe it was enough, maybe not. But a man can only do what his conscience tells him to do and hope God understands the rest. Mabel, if you find this, know that every sunset in this canyon reminded me of the light in your eyes. Sarah, grow up strong and choose your own path. But remember that sometimes the hardest choices are the most necessary ones. I love you both, always. The journal ended there, its final pages blank testimony to a story cut short by circumstances beyond anyone's control. In the silence that followed Mabel's reading, the 3 of them sat with the weight of revelation, understanding finally complete. Red hadn't abandoned his family for adventure. He died protecting the community that had given them a home, making the hardest choice a man could make, risking everything he loved to preserve the world his daughter would inherit. He was a hero, Sarah said finally, her voice wondering. All these years I thought he was selfish, irresponsible. But he was a hero. He was a man, Mabel corrected gently. A good man who tried to do right, even when it cost him everything. That's all any of us can be. Pete closed the journal carefully, wrapping it again in its protective leather. This should go to Sheriff Morrison, he said. Set the record straight about what happened here, but they all knew the real value of the journal wasn't in its historical significance. It was in the healing it had brought to a family fractured by misunderstanding. The peace it offered to hearts that had carried anger and grief too long, in the desert silence, with Red's words still echoing in their minds. The three of them prepared to complete the journey that had brought them here. Not just the physical journey to Devil's Rest, but the emotional journey toward understanding, forgiveness, and the kind of closure that can only come from finally knowing the truth. As Pete rewrapped the journal, something crinkled between the pages, a folded paper that had been pressed flat against the back cover. Mabel carefully extracted it, unfolding what appeared to be an official document, water-stained but still legible. The bold letters across the top read, "Wanted for murder," in stark black ink. "What is it?" Sarah asked, leaning closer. The poster bore the crude but recognizable sketches of three men, their faces rendered with the harsh lines typical of frontier law enforcement art. Below each image was a name and a list of crimes that made for grim reading. Jack Colton, wanted for murder. Robbery, cattle theft, 500 reward. William Snake Morrison, wanted for murder, assault, cattle theft, 300 reward. Thomas Hartley, wanted for murder, robbery, rape, cattle theft, 750 reward. Sweet Jesus, Pete breathed, recognizing the significance immediately. The Colton Gang. These were some of the most dangerous men in the territory. Mabel studied the poster with growing understanding. At the bottom, in Red's careful handwriting, was a note. Sheriff confirmed, these are the men we're tracking. Professional killers. No witnesses left alive in previous raids. Cannot risk word getting back to them. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Red hadn't simply chosen duty over family. He'd been tracking men who would have murdered anyone they suspected of identifying them. His silence hadn't been about masculine pride or frontier honor. It had been about keeping his family safe from killers who eliminated threats without hesitation. This changes everything, Sarah said, her voice hollow. He couldn't tell us because knowing would have put us in danger, Pete nodded grimly. Colton's bunch didn't leave loose ends. If they'd suspected Red had a family who might identify them, they'd have visited your ranch. All of you would have ended up dead. The wanted poster revealed details that made Red's journal entries even more tragic. The amounts of the bounties spoke to the severity of their crimes, but it was the list of their known associates that painted the full picture of what Red had been facing. 15 to 20 men, all experienced killers, operating with the kind of coordination that suggested military training. Look at this, Mabel said, pointing to smaller text at the bottom of the poster. Known to torture victims for information about local law enforcement and potential witnesses. Approach with extreme caution. The words sent a chill through all of them. Red hadn't just been protecting the cattle and the ranchers. He'd been protecting everyone who might be connected to the investigation. His decision to keep Mabel and Sarah ignorant of the danger had been an act of love, not neglect. Sarah sank down onto a convenient rock, the full weight of revelation overwhelming her. All these years I've been angry at him for leaving us, but he was protecting us. If we'd known what he was really doing, if we'd tried to help or even just worried publicly about the danger, they'd have come for you, Pete finished bluntly. That's how men like Colton operated. Kill the threat, kill anyone connected to the threat, kill anyone who might become a threat. Your father kept you safe the only way he could, by keeping you ignorant. Mabel turned the poster over and found more of Red's handwriting on the back. Notes about the gang's movements, their habits, their suspected routes. It was the work of a man conducting serious intelligence gathering, not the casual observations of someone playing at being a lawman. Colton moves camp every 3 days. Always posts sentries. Horses kept saddled at night for quick escape. These men have done this before many times. They know how to avoid capture and how to eliminate threats. Henderson thinks we can just ride in and arrest them. He doesn't understand what we're dealing with. These aren't drunken cowboys making trouble. These are professionals who kill for a living. Your father was right to be cautious, Pete said after reading the notes. Henderson and his boys probably walked right into an ambush. Men like that, they'd have had scouts watching for pursuit. Traps set for anyone foolish enough to come straight at them. Sarah was studying the sketched faces on the poster, trying to imagine her father facing such men. How did he know so much about them? This reads like he'd been watching them for days. He had been, Mabel realized, finding another entry in the journal she'd missed on first reading. Listen to this. May 17th, spent 2 days observing their main camp from the ridge above. They're professionals, no doubt about it. Military precision in everything they do. Colton himself was cavalry. I can tell by how he handles the horses, how he positions the sentries. This isn't going to be a simple arrest. The picture that emerged was of Red conducting a dangerous solo reconnaissance mission, gathering intelligence that could help law enforcement plan a proper response. He'd understood that rushing in would only get good men killed, but he'd also known that waiting too long would allow the gang to escape entirely. He was trying to be smart about it, Pete observed. Gather information, call for proper backup, do things right. But the other ranchers lost patience. Another paper fell from the journal as Mabel turned more pages, a crude map drawn in Red's hand, showing the gang's camp, their escape routes, the locations where they'd posted guards. It was detailed intelligence work, the kind that could have saved lives if it had reached the right people in time. He knew exactly what he was doing, Sarah said wonderingly. This isn't the work of some reckless cowboy looking for adventure. This is careful, methodical investigation. The map showed something else that made Mabel's heart ache. Red had identified multiple escape routes from the area, but none of them led directly home. Every path he'd mapped led away from their ranch, away from Mabel and Sarah. Even in planning his own escape, he'd been thinking of their safety. "Look here," Pete said, pointing to markings on the map. He marked water sources, but only the ones that would take him further from civilization. Your father wasn't planning to come straight home, even if things went well. He was going to make sure he wasn't followed first. Sarah traced the lines on the map with her finger, following routes that would have taken her father through some of the most remote country in the territory. How long would it have taken him to get home using these paths? "Weeks," Pete said. "Maybe a month if he was being really careful. Your father was planning for the possibility that some of these men might escape, might come looking for whoever had been watching them." The revelation added another layer to their understanding of Red's sacrifice. He hadn't just risked his life to stop the rustlers. He'd accepted the possibility of prolonged separation from his family, weeks or months of not knowing if they were safe, all to ensure that his actions didn't bring danger to their door. He really did think of everything, Mabel said softly. Every choice he made was about protecting us, keeping us safe. But the poster held one more revelation that changed everything they thought they knew about the outcome of Red's mission. In the corner, almost illegible, was a stamped notation: Colton Gang captured June 1885, California border. Below it, in different handwriting, all 3 leaders killed during arrest attempt. They got them, Sarah breathed. The gang was captured. Father's mission actually succeeded. Pete studied the notation carefully. June 1885. That's just weeks after your father died. The law must have used his intelligence to track them down. But Red never knew, Mabel realized, her voice breaking. He died thinking he'd failed, thinking the rustlers had escaped to terrorize other communities. He never knew that his work led to their capture. The cruel irony hit them all simultaneously. Red had died believing his sacrifice had been in vain, never knowing that his careful intelligence gathering had provided law enforcement with exactly what they needed to track down and eliminate the threat. His death had saved not just the local ranchers, but countless other potential victims across the territory. The sheriff would have known, Pete said quietly. When they caught the gang, they'd have realized where the information came from. Your father was probably credited as a hero in the official reports. But we never heard, Sarah said. We were just told he'd disappeared while helping track rustlers. No one ever told us he was a hero. That's the frontier for you, Pete replied. Dead heroes don't need recognition, and live families need protection. Better to let people think Red just wandered off than to advertise that he'd been the one who brought down the Colton gang. As they sat in the canyon where Red had made his final stand, surrounded by the evidence of his true story, the three of them finally understood the full scope of what had happened. Red hadn't abandoned his family, he'd saved them and countless others, through careful planning and willing sacrifice. His death hadn't been meaningless. It had been the price of intelligence that led to justice. He was everything I always believed he was, Mabel said, tears flowing freely now. And more than I ever knew. Sarah held the wanted poster in trembling hands, looking at the faces of the men her father had died fighting. I owe him an apology, she whispered. 11 years of anger, and all this time he was protecting us. The truth had set them free, but it had also revealed the terrible cost of misunderstanding, the price of secrets kept for love. In the end, Red's greatest victory hadn't been stopping the rustlers. It had been reuniting his family with the truth, healing wounds that had festered in ignorance, and proving that love could survive even death when it was built on understanding rather than assumption. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Devil's Rest, as the three of them sat in contemplative silence, the weight of revelation settling around them like desert dust. The wanted poster lay between them, its grim faces a reminder of the danger Red had faced alone, the terrible responsibility he'd shouldered to protect not just his family, but an entire community. Sarah was the first to move, rising slowly and walking to where her father's remains lay beneath their protective canvas. For the first time since their arrival, she approached without hesitation, without the angry resistance that had marked her earlier interactions with his memory. I need to see him, she said quietly. Really see him, not just the bones, but I need to understand who he was when he died. Pete and Mabel exchanged glances, recognizing the significance of this moment. Sarah was finally ready to confront not just the fact of her father's death, but the man he'd been in his final moments. Not the abandoning father of her angry fantasies, but the protector who died keeping danger from their door. Carefully, reverently, Pete lifted the canvas covering. In the late afternoon light, the remains seemed less stark, more peaceful. Red's skeleton lay in a posture of final protection, one arm still curved around Copper's smaller form, as if even in death he was sheltering something precious. Sarah knelt beside the remains, her city dress gathering desert sand as she studied what was left of the man who'd shaped her first 14 years. He's still wearing his wedding ring, she observed, her voice full of wonder. Indeed, the simple gold band still encircled the bone of Red's left ring finger, its surface dulled by years of wind and sand, but otherwise intact. Mabel had noticed it earlier, but hadn't trusted herself to remove it, afraid that touching it would somehow disturb the profound peace that seemed to surround Red's final resting place. He never took it off, Mabel said softly. In 23 years of marriage, I never saw him without it. Said it reminded him who he belonged to. Sarah reached out tentatively, then stopped. May I? Should I take it for you? We both should, Mabel said, moving to kneel beside her daughter. Together, mother and daughter worked in careful coordination, their hands touching as they gently worked the ring free from bone that had held it faithfully for 11 years. It came away easily, as if Red had been waiting for this moment to return it to its rightful owner. The ring was warm from the desert sun, heavier than Mabel remembered. She held it in her palm, feeling the weight of all the years it had spent on Red's hand, all the work it had witnessed, all the love it had symbolized. The band was worn smooth in places, marked by the kind of honest labor that had defined Red's life. Look, Sarah said, pointing to something carved inside the band. There's an inscription. Mabel tilted the ring to catch the light, revealing words etched in Red's careful script. Forever yours, M. Below it, in different lettering, were 2 dates, their wedding day, and another that made Mabel's breath catch. "That's the day Sarah was born," she whispered. He had it engraved after she was born, to mark the day our family was complete. Sarah traced the dates with her fingertip, her eyes filling with tears. "He carried us with him. Even out here, facing those terrible men, he carried us with him." The ring seemed to embody everything they'd learned about Red's true story, his devotion to family even as duty called him away, his willingness to sacrifice everything rather than risk bringing danger to those he loved. It was a tangible symbol of love that had survived death, waiting patiently to be reclaimed. "I want you to have it," Mabel said suddenly, offering the ring to Sarah. "Your father would want you to understand what it meant to him, what you meant to him." "No," Sarah replied, gently closing her mother's fingers around the ring. "It belongs to you. You're the one who waited, who kept faith when the rest of us gave up hope. You're the one who deserves to wear his love." Pete watched this exchange with the quiet appreciation of a man who'd seen many kinds of courage in his life. "Might I suggest," he said carefully, "that you both wear it, maybe on a chain, so you can both carry it close to your hearts?" It was perfect solution, one that honored both the marriage the ring had symbolized and the family bond it had witnessed. Mabel removed the chain from around her neck, the one that had carried Red's ring all these years, and threaded it through the band. But instead of putting it back around her own neck, she gestured for Sarah to lean forward. "Together," she said, draping the chain so it rested around both their necks, connecting them in a way that felt both symbolic and practical. The way it should be. As the afternoon progressed, they began the careful work of preparing for the burial ceremony they would hold the following morning. Pete, with the wisdom of someone who'd helped many families say goodbye to loved ones in this harsh country, guided them through the decisions that needed to be made. Red chose a good spot, he observed, surveying the canyon with an expert eye. Protected from wind, elevated enough to stay dry if the rare rains come. The canyon walls will keep him safe, and the morning sun will warm him. A man could do worse for his final resting place. They selected a site near the canyon's eastern wall, where an ancient landslide had created a natural terrace. The spot offered protection from the elements while remaining accessible for future visits. More importantly, it felt peaceful, the kind of place where a man like Red could rest in the certain knowledge that his work was done, his family safe. "What about Copper?" Sarah asked, looking at the faithful dog's remains. "Should they be buried together?" "Of course," Mabel replied without hesitation. "Copper earned his place beside your father. Loyalty like that deserves recognition." As they worked to prepare the burial site, using tools Pete had brought for the purpose, Sarah found herself thinking about the man she'd spent 11 years resenting. Each revelation had stripped away another layer of her anger, replacing it with a grief that was clean and honest, uncomplicated by misunderstanding. "I barely remember him," she admitted as they worked. I remember specific moments, him teaching me to braid rope, carrying me on his shoulders when I was small. But I don't remember what it felt like to be his daughter, to have him as part of my daily life." "He was patient," Mabel said, pausing in her work to share memories. "Patient with your questions, patient with your mistakes. He used to say that raising a daughter was like gentling a wild horse. You had to earn trust before you could teach anything useful." "Did he want sons?" Sarah asked. "Most men want sons to carry on their name." "He wanted you," Mabel replied firmly. "He used to tell people that God had given him exactly the child he needed, smart enough to avoid his mistakes, stubborn enough to fight for what she believed in, and brave enough to make her own way in the world." Sarah felt tears begin again, mourning not just the father she'd lost, but the relationship she'd never fully appreciated. "I wish I could tell him I understand now. I wish I could apologize for being angry for so long." "He knows," Pete said quietly, speaking from long experience with grief and regret. "Dead folks generally understand more than we give them credit for. Your father's probably been waiting all these years for you to figure out the truth." As evening approached, they made their camp nearby, close enough to Red's resting place to feel connected, but far enough away to avoid disturbing the sight. The desert sunset painted the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson, creating a natural cathedral that seemed designed for moments of profound significance. Around their small campfire, as stars began to emerge in the vast desert sky, the three of them planned the ceremony that would finally give Red the goodbye he deserved. They would bury him with his journal, so future generations would know his story. They would include the compass that had guided him faithfully until the end, and they would place the wanted poster with him as well, proof that his sacrifice had meaning, that justice had been served. "What should we say?" Sarah asked. "I mean, what words do you use for someone who died, protecting people who never knew they were in danger?" "The truth," Mabel replied. "We tell the truth about who he was and what he did. We let his actions speak for themselves." Pete stirred the fire with a stick, sending sparks into the darkness. "In my experience, the best farewells are the ones that come from the heart, not from any book or tradition. You just speak to him like he's listening, because maybe he is." As they prepared for sleep, each lost in their own thoughts about the ceremony to come, Mabel fingered the ring that now connected her to her daughter. Tomorrow, they would say goodbye to Red, but they would also complete the healing that his death had made necessary. They would restore the family bonds that grief and misunderstanding had strained nearly to breaking. In the morning, they would honor a man who'd lived and died by a code of honor that put others' welfare ahead of his own safety. They would celebrate a love that had survived separation, death, and 11 years of anger. And they would begin the work of carrying his memory forward in a way that honored both his sacrifice and the family he died protecting. The desert night settled around them, vast and eternal, holding their small camp in its ancient embrace. Somewhere in that darkness, Red's spirit could finally rest, knowing that the truth had been revealed, that his family understood at last the price he'd paid for their safety, and the love that had motivated every choice he'd made. Dawn came gently to Devil's Rest, the eastern canyon wall catching first light and painting the stone in shades of rose and gold. Mabel woke to the sound of Sarah moving quietly around their camp, and when she sat up, she saw her daughter already dressed and gathering something from the canyon floor. "What are you doing?" Mabel asked softly, not wanting to wake Pete, who still slept beneath his bedroll nearby. "Looking for flowers," Sarah replied, holding up a small collection of desert blooms she'd found growing in crevices and protected spots throughout the canyon. "Father always said that anything beautiful enough to grow in hard places deserved recognition." The bouquet was modest but touching. Tiny purple flowers that had bloomed briefly after recent rains, delicate yellow blossoms that caught morning light like small suns, and tough desert sage with its silvery green leaves that released their sharp, clean fragrance when crushed. Together, they represented the surprising beauty that could flourish in even the harshest circumstances. "He would like that," Mabel said, rising to help her daughter add to the collection. They worked together in the growing light, finding scattered blooms that seemed almost miraculous in their ability to draw life from sand and stone. Pete woke to find them arranging the flowers with careful attention, creating something that would honor both the beauty of the desert Red had loved and the brief, precious nature of all growing things. "That's a fine tribute," he observed, recognizing the symbolism in their choice. "Your father understood that country like this, knew how to find the good even when times were hard." They prepared for the ceremony with quiet efficiency, each understanding the significance of what they were about to do. This wasn't just a burial. It was the completion of a journey that had begun 11 years ago, the final chapter of a story that had been suspended in grief and misunderstanding. The site they'd prepared lay in morning sunlight, the grave carefully dug and lined with flat stones Pete had selected for their strength and permanence. Red and Copper would rest together as they had died, faithful companions who'd chosen loyalty over survival, love over safety. Mabel approached the remains with the compass in her hands, its brass surface catching the early light. "This guided you faithfully for so many years," she said softly. as if speaking directly to Red. Now it can rest with you, pointing the way to whatever comes next. Sarah placed her wildflower bouquet beside the compass, the fragile blooms, a stark contrast to the enduring metal, but somehow perfectly appropriate. "For beauty in hard places," she whispered. "The way you taught me to look for it." Pete had brought his own contribution, a smooth river stone marked with the sign of the cross, carved by his own hand during the long night. "For a man who lived his faith," he said simply, placing it where Red's head would rest. As they worked to move the remains with proper dignity, each item was placed with careful intention. The journal went with Red, wrapped again in its protective leather, so that anyone who might find him in future years would understand his story. The wanted poster was included as well, proof that his sacrifice had meaning, or that justice had been served. "Red Sutton," Mabel began, her voice carrying across the quiet canyon. "Beloved husband, devoted father, protector of those who needed protection. You were taken from us too soon, but not before you showed us what real courage looks like." Her words echoed slightly off the canyon walls, as if the desert itself was listening, bearing witness to their farewell. Sarah stepped forward, ready to add her own tribute to the man she'd finally learned to understand. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see who you really were," she said, her voice stronger than she'd expected. "I spent 11 years angry at you for leaving us, when you died protecting us. I wish I could have known you as an adult, could have appreciated the man you were, instead of just mourning the father I lost." Pete removed his hat, holding it against his chest as he offered his own words. "I didn't know Red Sutton in life, but I've seen his character in the choices he made. Any man who'd face killers to protect his neighbors, who'd die before he'd let danger reach his family, is the kind of man this country was built by." He earned his rest. The ceremony continued with the careful placement of soil, each handful representing not just burial, but restoration. Red returning to the earth that had shaped him, the desert reclaiming one of its own. The work was done in contemplative silence, broken only by the sound of wind through stone and the distant cry of a hawk circling high above. When it was finished, they stood together before the simple grave, marked by the stone cairn they'd rebuilt and enhanced. The wildflowers lay bright against the earth, their colors vivid in the morning sun. It was a resting place that honored both the man and the country that had claimed him. Stark but beautiful, enduring but peaceful. "It's finished," Mabel said finally, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders that she'd carried for 11 years. The long uncertainty was over, the questions answered, the goodbye finally spoken. Red could rest now, and perhaps more importantly, so could they. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the canyon and chasing away the last shadows of night. In the growing light, the grave seemed to settle naturally into the landscape, becoming part of the eternal story the desert told about survival, sacrifice, and the mysterious ways that love endures, even death. As the morning progressed and the ceremony's immediate emotions settled into something deeper and more lasting, Sarah found herself drawn back to the gravesite repeatedly. Each time she approached, she seemed to discover something new she needed to say, some additional piece of understanding that required acknowledgement. "I keep thinking about all the times I defended him," she said to Mabel during one of these moments. "When people in town would ask about his disappearance, when they'd suggest he might have just run off, I'd get so angry, tell them they didn't know him, that he'd never abandon his family. But then I'd come home and be angry at him myself for proving them right." "You were protecting him even when you couldn't forgive him," Mabel observed. "That says something about the love you carried, even when it was buried under hurt." Sarah knelt beside the grave, her hands resting on the stone cairn they'd built. "I want to tell him I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Not just for being angry, but for not trusting what I knew about his character, for letting fear turn me against his memory." "Then tell him," Pete suggested, from where he was packing their remaining supplies. "Dead folks are generally good listeners." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling foolish, but needing to speak the words aloud. "Daddy," she began, using the childhood name she hadn't spoken in 20 years. "I'm sorry I didn't understand. I'm sorry I let my fear of being abandoned turn into anger at you for dying. You deserved better from me, deserved the kind of faith Mama kept all these years. The words seemed to hang in the desert air, absorbed by stone and sand that had witnessed countless human dramas play out across centuries. When Sarah opened her eyes, she felt lighter somehow, as if speaking the apology had released something she'd been carrying without realizing its weight. "He knows," Mabel said softly, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "And more than that, he understands. Your father was never one to hold grudges, especially against people he loved." As they prepared to leave the canyon for the final time, Sarah felt compelled to take something with her, some tangible reminder of this place where her understanding of her father had been transformed. She found a small leather pouch in her traveling bag, meant for holding coins, and carefully filled it with sand from beside Red's grave. "What's that for?" Mabel asked, watching her daughter's careful movements. "I want to remember this place," Sarah explained. "Not just the sadness of where he died, but the peace of where he rests. And I want something to remind me of what love looks like when it endures beyond death." The small pouch of desert sand would return with them to civilization, a tactile memory of the harsh beauty that had claimed Red's life, but also preserved his story. It represented the transformation that had taken place in this canyon, not just the revelation of truth, but the healing of hearts that had been broken by misunderstanding. Pete watched their final preparations with the satisfaction of a man who'd completed a difficult job well. He'd guided many people through dangerous country over the years, but few journeys had felt as significant as this one. The physical travel had been the easy part. The emotional journey they'd completed was the real accomplishment. "You ladies ready to head home?" he asked gently, recognizing that leaving would be difficult despite the healing they'd found. "Almost," Mabel replied, taking one last look around the canyon that had become sacred ground for their family. "I just want to remember how this feels, having closure, having peace with what happened." Sarah stood beside her mother, both of them looking at the grave that contained not just Red's remains, but years of questions that had finally been answered. The morning sun was climbing toward noon, and the practical demands of travel required their attention, but neither wanted to rush this final moment. "He would want us to go," Sarah said finally. "He'd want us to take what we've learned here and use it to build something better than what we had before." "You're right," Mabel agreed. "He always believed in moving forward, in making the best of whatever situation you found yourself in." As they mounted their horses and prepared to leave Devil's Rest, the three travelers carried with them more than they'd brought. They'd arrived as separate individuals, bound by obligation and old pain. They were leaving as a family reunited by truth and forgiveness. The canyon seemed different as they rode out, not just a place of death and loss, but a place of revelation and reconciliation. The morning light that had witnessed Red's burial also illuminated new possibilities for the family he'd left behind. Behind them, the grave settled into the timeless rhythm of the desert, becoming part of the landscape's eternal story. Red Sutton could rest now, his sacrifice understood, his love vindicated, his family finally whole again despite his absence. The wind that had carved the canyon continued its ancient work, but it would preserve rather than erode what they'd built here, a monument not just to one man's courage, but to the power of truth to heal even the deepest wounds. The journey home passed differently than their trip into the desert had. Where before there had been tension and careful politeness between mother and daughter, now there was easy conversation, shared memories, and the comfortable silence of people who no longer needed to guard their words. The physical landscape remained unchanged, but the emotional territory they traveled had been transformed entirely. Sarah rode with new confidence, her body remembering rhythms that city life had nearly erased. More importantly, she rode with new purpose, her mind already working through possibilities that would have seemed impossible just days before. "I've been thinking," she said, as they paused to rest the horses at midday. "About what comes next, I mean." about what Father would want us to do with what we've learned. Mabel settled into the shade of a large boulder, grateful for the respite from the desert sun. "Oh, what are you thinking?" "I think he'd want his story told properly. Not just the tragedy of what happened to him, but the truth about why it happened, what he was really doing out there." Sarah's voice carried a conviction that had been absent for years. People should know that there was a man who died protecting them, even if they never knew they were in danger. Pete nodded approvingly. Stories like that need telling. Help people understand what courage really looks like. But more than that, Sarah continued, her thoughts gaining momentum, I think he'd want us to be a family again. Really be a family, not just people who share blood and bitter memories. The words hung in the warm air between them, heavy with implication. Mabel felt her heart begin to hope for something she'd thought lost forever. Not just reconciliation with her daughter, but restoration of the closeness they'd shared before grief drove them apart. "What are you saying, Sarah?" "I'm saying that Thomas and I have been talking about making some changes. His business is established enough now that he doesn't need to be in San Francisco constantly. And I've missed this." She gestured at the landscape around them, the vast openness that had once felt like a prison but now seemed like freedom. "I've missed home." The confession was simple but profound. For 20 years, Sarah had defined herself in opposition to her frontier upbringing, building a life that was the deliberate opposite of everything her childhood had represented. But the desert had reminded her of what she'd lost in that transformation, not just connection to the land, but connection to the parts of herself that had been shaped by Red's patient teaching and Mabel's quiet strength. By the time they reached the ranch in late afternoon, the three travelers had begun planning a future that honored the past while embracing new possibilities. Sarah would return to San Francisco to settle her affairs, but she and Thomas would relocate to Nevada within the year. They would build a house on the portion of ranch land Mabel had kept, close enough for daily contact, but separate enough to respect each other's independence. "Father would like knowing we're together again," Sarah said, as they stood on the porch of her childhood home, looking out over land that Red had loved and died protecting. "He always worried about what would happen to you if something happened to him. He made me promise once that I'd take care of you if anything ever happened," Mabel remembered. "I told him you were perfectly capable of taking care of yourself. He said that wasn't the point. Family was supposed to take care of each other, not because they had to, but because they wanted to." As evening settled over the ranch, Pete prepared to leave for his own home, his part in their story complete. Before he mounted his horse, he offered some final wisdom born of years spent guiding people through difficult journeys. "What you folks accomplished out there," he said, "that's rarer than you might think. Most people carry their hurts to the grave, never get the chance to understand what really happened or why. You got something precious, truth, and the healing that comes with it. Don't waste it." In the weeks that followed, word spread through the community about the discovery at Devil's Rest and the true story of Red Sutton's disappearance. The revelation that he died tracking the notorious Colton gang transformed him from a man who'd mysteriously vanished into a local hero who'd sacrificed everything to protect his neighbors. Sheriff Morrison came to the ranch, personally to deliver the official recognition of Red's service, along with a commendation that would be placed in the territorial records. "Your husband was a better man than most of us deserved," he told Mabel. "His intelligence work was crucial to capturing those killers. But the formal recognition, while meaningful, mattered less than the informal restoration of Red's reputation among people who'd known him. Stories emerged of his quiet generosity, his reliability, his willingness to help anyone in need. The community's memory of him shifted from puzzlement to pride, from questions to gratitude. Sarah returned to San Francisco as planned, but her letters now carried a warmth and frequency that spoke of genuine connection rather than dutiful obligation. She wrote about selling the house on Nob Hill, about Thomas's excitement over the prospect of frontier life, about plans for their new home that would honor Red's memory while serving their own needs. 6 months after their desert journey, Sarah and Thomas arrived at the ranch to stay. They brought with them not just their possessions, but a photographer Sarah had hired to document their reunion. The resulting image, Mabel and Sarah standing together on the porch where Red had once kissed his family goodbye, became a treasured symbol of restoration and hope. In the photograph, both women wear expressions of deep contentment, their hands linked, their faces bearing the marks of lives that had been tested by loss but strengthened by love. Between them, almost invisible to casual observers, hangs the chain that carries Red's wedding ring, a tangible reminder of the man whose sacrifice had made their reunion possible. The small pouch of desert sand sat on Mabel's mantle, beside the photograph and other mementos of their journey to Devil's Rest. Sometimes, when the evening light caught it just right, the sand seemed to sparkle with its own inner fire, holding memories of a place where truth had conquered misunderstanding, where love had proven stronger than death, and where a family broken by tragedy had discovered the grace to make itself whole again. Outside the ranch house windows, the Nevada desert stretched endlessly toward distant mountains, its harsh beauty unchanged by human drama. But for the women who called this place home, the landscape had been transformed by understanding. It was no longer the cruel country that had claimed Red Sutton's life. It was the sacred ground where his true story had finally been told, where his family had finally come home.